Just kidding.
Well, we have a friend speaking today. Milt Marcy is a businessman and owner of an insurance agency for the last 40 years. He is an independent researcher of species thought to be extinct, including an actual sighting of a living pterodactyl in 2015. Milt has worked in Central Africa and Papua New Guinea and is the author of The Emperors Who Had No Clothes, Exposing the Hidden Roots of the Evolutionary Agenda. Let's give Milt a nice, warm welcome.
Okay, I guess my sound is on, and we've got our video ready to go here. You know, it's really great here to be speaking in front of the Carnegie Hall of monthly creationist meetings. We've had, I was looking back over the last year, we've had, and these are people that normally come at least once a year, Thomas Kindle, Eric Hovind, Bruce Malone, forgetting a couple, Chris Ashcroft, one more, but anyway, every one of them always raves about coming to this meeting because A, it's well attended, and the people that are here really know what they know the subject matter. They're educated in the creationist issues. The only negative I've heard is that you have to be kind of careful what you say because there might be somebody out there in the audience that knows more about it than you do. And that might be the case today. So let me see here if we can get this thing rolling. Up on the screen you see the 5 guys that I called emperors, and they're arranged chronologically. On the left is James Hutton, who was born in 1726. He's the guy that kind of got the ball rolling. And then we have the next guy who was born the year Hutton died, which was 1797. That's Charles Lyell. And Lyell's kind of the guy that orchestrated the whole thing that put us down this rabbit hole. Then we have Charles Darwin, and he was, of course, wrote the book that gave the underpinning for the evolutionist idea. And then we have Thomas Huxley, born in 1825, who was more or less in charge of pushing that idea into the public sphere. And then we have Mr. John Dewey, which was responsible for bringing those ideas into the American educational system and enforcing them. See if I can find my, here we go. This is the way the book looked before. And it's, let me see here. I gotta get my, forgot one thing. Oops, back. As you can tell, I'm not adept at this stuff. I have J.D. Mitchell to thank for as much as I do know. He really helped me a lot on this. All right. So what I liken this to is like, let's say you have a friend that came and told you about some great idea that they came up with, and they present what looks like evidence and convince you that it's a really scientific argument, and you get kind of excited about it, and you go tell all your friends. And some of your friends believe it, and some don't. But you're invested in it. And then sometime later, your original friend comes back to you and says, you know what I told you that time, it wasn't really true. I just wanted to see if you believe it. And so what would you then do? Would you go back and try to convince your other friends scientifically that this whole idea was wrong? Or would you just simply tell them, you know, the guy that told me this lied, and so forget what I said, it's not true? I think you'd do the latter. Well, this is kind of analogous to what we're talking about here, because I'm going to show you that the emperors have lied and they've admitted to it. So all we need to do is dig out that evidence, and then you don't need to know the science. You don't need to know the scriptural arguments for creation. All you got to do is point back and show that these guys, A, they didn't know anything about what they were talking about, and B, what they were talking about, they were highly influenced to try to divert the church. That was their whole purpose. Let's see here. About 200 years ago, around 1800, everyone believed in an earth that was about 5,700 years old. There were a few people that had different ideas, but it was a very common thing. Let's see, you can voice your opinion when we get done here about what you think about all this. I'd be interested in hearing it. I do have answers for all your questions. It's just that the answers are often wrong. Whoops. Back. We'll get it here. This is what the book looked like before, and I changed it a little bit, and so I updated it, put in some color pictures, because I thought in some of those pictures color would be much better. Added a little bit to it, and gave a few more references. The reason I came up with this was because years ago, I thought about the whole idea of the creation-evolution debate, and it just didn't appear to me that there was scientific evidence for a really old Earth. I'd never heard anything that wasn't refutable by a good creationist argument. So I thought, well, let's go back and take a look. I'll bet there's a lot of information available if you just take the time to search it all out. Let's go back and take a look and see what evidence there is to support my idea that this was all a trumped-up thing to destroy the church. And the more I got into it, the more I realized that was true. This book here, there is no other that I know of in the world, other than in the archives of the British National Library. And so I wanted to get this because, and this is just part 3 of the book. This is 755 pages. The whole book was 2,200, but it was published in 1794. And it's James Hutton's Ideas on Philosophy and Religion. And that's what I really wanted to know. I was afraid I would not be able to get this book. I looked in all the libraries in the United States, couldn't find it. Looked in the libraries in Europe, couldn't find it. And then I decided to try the British National Library in London, and they had it in their archives. So I said, what do I need to do to get that? And she says, well, we'll run a copy off on a CD and mail it to you if you want. And she figured it up. I need to pay her $120 or something like that. So I gave her my card number right over the phone. It was midnight here, and they were open over there. A few days later, I got it, and I had it run back off at Kinko's on the paper. And as you can see, every time I'd run across an interesting quote, I'd make a note and put a little tab so I could come back later and look at all those tabs and see which one I wanted to use in the book. And then this book is the Life and Letters of Charles Lyell. And a lot of people don't understand that these guys, they kept all of their letters to and from. Darwin has like 14,000. I don't know how many Lyell has. It's a few thousand. And even Hutton has letters. And then they've got books that have stuff written in them that nobody ever reads. You'll find stuff in those books like the one, Hutton's book. And so I didn't realize at the time when I started this that there was that much information available. But I had more fun writing the book, I think, than maybe most people have reading it, because I was just learning stuff like crazy. And what I'm telling you about today is just the tip of the iceberg. You'll find a lot more examples when you go into the book. This is actually Lyell's well-planned assault on the Bible and the Church of England. They were aiming their fusillade directly at the Church of England. In those days, in that place, they didn't really know much about anything else. And I will tell you that the Church of England had some major problems, and they really kind of messed things up for themselves. But they weren't deserving of all that. And then I was thinking, well, you know, when you're writing about these guys, they're like icons for the evolutionists, the secularists. So I may be, if this thing got traction and more people came to know about it, I might be, they might take pictures of me and put them on the wall and throw darts at them. I hope it's not any worse than that. Okay. Here's an image of the cover of the current edition of the book, which is back on the table. Let's see, we have more information added, some edited better in the color pictures. This is an image of James Hutton. The most interesting thing I always thought about this picture is that stack of paper behind him, or beside him there on the table. He was prolific in his writing. Unfortunately, he wasn't a very good writer. And so when you're reading his stuff from 225 years ago, and it's written in Old English, and he wasn't very good at writing their English, you got to kind of take your time in getting through it in order to get out of it what he's trying to say. He's generally regarded as the original discoverer of the millions of years of Earth history, even though his ideas received little acceptance during his lifetime. Most people don't realize that. James Hutton was basically nothing as far as, if you were to ask somebody in 1790 who the 5 greatest geologists were of that time, which was a new science, you still couldn't get a degree in geology, but there were a lot of people doing it on their own. But you have Werner, Desauger, Dolomieu, well, there were about 4 or 5, but nobody would mention James Hutton as being one of those. He did have a couple admirers, though, which I will tell you about. This is a statement typical of many modern writers when writing about Hutton. It is from biographers Donald B. McIntyre and Alan McCurdy. And what do I do with my pointer right here? Hutton provided unequivocal evidence that the Earth was far older than generally believed. Unequivocal. I beg to differ with you. His theory, based on extensive field evidence, yeah, we'll study that a little bit more to see how extensive that was. It was confirmed from further observations made specifically to test it. And in the book, I go into some detail about some of those attempts to verify it, and you'll see where all the holes lie. And this is Jack Repchak, who also wrote a biography. For Darwin, the key insight in Lyell's book was that the Earth is profoundly old, an idea that Lyell properly credits to James Hutton in the first pages of his book. If Darwin had not been jolted by Hutton and Lyell into appreciating the age of the Earth, it is arguable that he would not have deduced the theory of evolution. Actually, I'm sure he would not have deduced the theory of evolution. In Repchak's book, he states how both Lyell and Darwin were tied to Hutton's millions of years. However, Hutton's contemporaries had a much lower view of the value of Hutton's ideas. This is how Hutton's theory was described by his contemporary friend and biographer, John Playfair. Playfair described the reception of his hypothesis when he first presented it at the Royal Society of Edinburgh in 1785, saying this, and that's what we got up here. The truth is that that is the theory of the Earth. It drew their attention very slowly. This is his friend admitting this. It drew their attention very slowly, so that several years had elapsed before anyone showed himself publicly concerned about it, either as an enemy or a friend. Why was that? Was it poor writing? Or because it contradicted a 6,000-year-old earth? Blasphemy, political consequences, no evidence. There were some Christians who objected because of that, but even the ones who were not Christians probably didn't want to endure the criticism that would have come about because of that. He was confronting a society that was much different than the society we have today by coming in and saying that the earth is way older than 6,000 years. If he'd have said that directly, they might have hung him. 100 years before that, there was a young man hung because of that. So you had to be real careful in those days. This is John Knox, 1517 to 1572. Scotland had become a Christian nation in the 1560s when John Knox was holding revivals. But by 1750, Edinburgh, though it led the world in technological advancement, had become a moral cesspool. There were clubs for every purpose under heaven. Alcohol was everywhere, and prostitution was even a part of the offerings of at least one club. And you can see there, Knox was, what have I done here? Cancel. Knox was somebody that was a dynamic personality, and in that 12 years from 1560 to when he died in 1572, the whole nation of Scotland was converted. I should say, it appeared the whole, I'm sure there was some that weren't, but it was a dramatic change. Hutton, along with two of his friends, Adam Smith and Joseph Black, opened the Oyster Club in 1778. They offered speakers from out of town discussing the arts and sciences, along with all the oysters you could eat and all the claret wine you could drink. They had clubs for every purpose. Hutton never married, although he had numerous mistresses, and he became the father of a child out of wedlock when he was 21. He had a distaste for Christianity and wrote the following regarding his roots in Judaism, or I said roots, regarding the roots of Judaism. The Jewish religion had its origin among some ancient tribes. We have reason to believe that it was, like the religion of all barbarous nations, founded on superstitious notions and suited to the ignorance and inhumanity of rude ages. So these men, all of them, I think, up until modern times, kind of interesting. You go back, the farther you go back, it seems like the lower view they had of the origins of mankind. They thought they were, cavemen, I guess, what we would say were cavemen. We have a different take on that nowadays, of course, what cavemen really were. I would now like to read a Hutton quote that is typical of how he spoke about the Christian faith, and I think I got this out of the big book here. There is nothing so incredible but what will be believed if coming from an authority that is not suspected, and if not opposed by the prejudice of the person whose faith is thus to be formed in superstition and not in science. So there you go with one of Hutton's statements that you have to study a little bit. Here's how I interpret it. People will believe anything if it comes from a religious authority and if not opposed by the prejudice, that is, beliefs of the person. They call Christian belief prejudice. Their faith will be based upon superstition, that is, Christianity, and not in science, which is deism. These statements are very remarkable when one realizes that when they were made at the end of the 1700s, blasphemy, which this was punishable by the death penalty. That is how strongly Hutton felt about it. He kind of kept it hidden a little bit, but 100 years earlier, 19-year-old Thomas Aikenhead had been hung for similar statements. Hutton was a little safer for several reasons. He was near the end of his life. He buried these comments in a massive 2,200-page book. He was on great terms with all of the important personages in Edinburgh. I think that's the main reason he wasn't even criticized for it. And in that 100 years, Edinburgh had changed dramatically, and that was also a big factor right there. Hutton was a classic deist. He believed there was a first cause, or presiding mind, they called it. If you were a deist, you'd call it God, either first cause or presiding mind, that had created everything and then stepped out of the picture to let it all run down on its own. The deist had no use for the Bible and felt that prayer was pointless because man's only responsibility was to make himself happy. I think the reason the words pursuit of happiness are in the American Declaration of Independence is because that document was heavily edited by deists Madison, Jefferson, and Franklin. I don't have any problem with people being happy, but when that's your main purpose in life, I think you do have a problem. Deism was much more sinister as a means of attacking the Bible than atheism. With deism, God is neutered. He is credited with creating everything, but is not allowed to interact with his creation at all. He has no personality and cares not at all about his creation. With atheism, the atheist must defend an indefensible proposition that there is no God. There is no way to prove there is no God. All people have an innate sense that there is a God. You may have heard that there are no atheists in foxholes. Deism actually, I think, was much more effective than atheism in destroying Christianity. Nevertheless, Hutton was well known by the movers and shakers of his time, included among his friends, and this was just the beginning. Joseph Black, this was probably his best friend. He was a discoverer of carbon dioxide. Joseph Priestley, the discoverer of oxygen and several other gases. James Watt, the developer of the steam engine. Adam Smith, the writer of Wealth of Nations, top source of how to run a capitalist society, still used today. David Hume, philosopher still quoted today, atheist philosopher, I might add. Erasmus Darwin, physician and paternal grandfather of Charles Darwin, was offered the job of royal physician, which he turned down. Josiah Wedgwood, of Wedgwood pottery fame, and Charles Darwin's maternal grandfather. Wedgwood pottery is still around today. Late in life, Hutton made two good friends who were much younger than he, John Playfair and Sir James Hall. They were awestruck by Hutton's personality and his standing in the Edinburgh social scene. He could probably be a stand-up comedian in today's world, and he would not need a script writer. He could think up the jokes as he went. Would like to have known the guy, actually, but I'm sure some of the jokes were pretty foul. This is my friend right here. Oh, you can't see that yet. That's next slide. Okay. This is Playfair's analysis of Hutton's personality. It is impossible by words to convey any idea of the effect of his conversation and of the impression made by so much philosophy, gaiety, and humor, accompanied by a manner at once so animated and so simple. Things are made known only by comparison, and that which is unique admits of no description. Playfair, in describing Hutton's effect, said, what I just read, despite all the accomplishments of his friends, Hutton was not known for any scientific achievements in his lifetime. He was, however, known and appreciated in the social and professional climate of 18th century Edinburgh. Now here's the guy that I said was my friend. When I wrote this, when I started writing, I didn't realize I was going to run into somebody 200 years before me, over 200 years actually, that believed exactly the same way I did and was willing to call him out on it. So Jean Deluc, he's my friend. One of the most popular geologists of that day was Jean Deluc. born in 1727 and died in 1817. So he was born a year after Hutton, died 20 years later. Probably lived a little cleaner life, I would guess. Georges Cuvier, a very well-respected geologist himself, said that Deluc was the foremost geologist in the world. He spent the first 46 years of his life in Geneva and the last 44 in Britain as the reader for the Queen, even though his native language was French. Deluc was the friend I never expected to find. Deluc, a strong Christian, was horrified by what he viewed as Hutton's attempt to destroy the Bible, and so wrote a 40-page review published in the October, November, and December editions of the British Critic. He annihilated both Hutton's book and Hutton himself. Typical was this statement that we see on the screen. Where do we see a succession of worlds as a part of the constitution of the earth? Only in the imagination of this author, who tries to conceal, and he's questioning his integrity right there, under the name of the wisdom of nature, which is the other words they use to describe deism, what he has himself devised against the Mosaic account of the earth. This is Hutton's fatherly advice to us, sarcasm alert, about why we should disregard any possibility of a worldwide flood having created the geologic conditions we see on the surface of the earth. And again, I had to dig to find this quote. It wasn't something he put out, right at the front of his book or anything. Philosophers, and this is Hutton right here talking, philosophers observing an apparent disorder and confusion in the solid part of this globe have no occasion for having any recourse to any unnatural supposition of evil. That would be the evil that caused the Genesis flood, to any destructive accidents in nature, which of course would be the Genesis flood, or to any agency of any preternatural cause, that would be God, in explaining that which now appears. Do you have any evidence, Mr. Hutton? James Hutton was able to throw, in his terms, millions of ages. He wasn't settling for years, it was millions of ages, into his hypothesis because he did not include a worldwide flood in it. Was it because of some geological reason? No. Here's the quote, more rejection by Hutton. Mr. Deluc, they went back and forth in their, Hutton responded to Deluc. Mr. Deluc has given us the history of a disaster which befell this well-contrived world, a disaster which caused the general deluge, and which without a miracle must have undone a system of living beings that are so well adapted to the present state of things. Deists hated miracles and they hated prophecy because those were things that were outside the observable world that they lived in, and basically disproved their whole theory. But surely general deluges form no part of the theory of the earth, for the purpose of this earth is evidently, now this word does not convey doubt as in modern usage, but is used to say, quote, the evidence points to maintain vegetable and animal life and not to destroy it. Of course, he didn't know anything about the original sin and the curse, or care about it. This guy may never have darkened a church door in his life, but he probably had stayed in many bars at night until they closed the doors. Here he is giving us a reason or a lesson in theology as he discusses Deluc's cosmogony. Mr. Deluc has given us the history of a disaster which befell this well-contrived world. Let's see, did I just read that? I think I did. Okay, let's go on to the next one. This is Hutton's magnum opus, Sicker Point. He assumes everything is moving very slowly because he has eliminated a worldwide flood. And if he is correct, then yes, These contrasting layers would take millions of years to orient like this. So like Darwin, he's using his conclusion to prove his conclusion. Darwin does that much. And you can see the vertical layers here. Oops, you got to turn it around first of all. The vertical layers, and then the horizontal, they come together right here. This is Hutton's magnum opus, Sicker Point. He assumes everything is moving very slowly. He had no valid reason to exclude a worldwide flood, and DeLuc pointed out to him that by doing so, he was not only excluding the biblical flood, but also hundreds of other flood legends and cultures all over the world. See, even at that time, they knew about all these other cultures that had the same flood legends. Nor did other geologists exclude the flood. Geology was not as important to Hutton as theology. Most people don't realize that. But has anyone besides DeLuc ever called him out on that? Not to my knowledge. Now, Taz Walker, who is a modern creationist, Taz has spoken here before. He's a man that I really respect for his geology. And this is kind of typical of modern wokeism. Generally, what they accuse someone else of is that which they are themselves guilty of. And Peter talks about that in the last days. Everything will be the exact opposite of what it looks like. So up is down, black is white, so on and so forth. And this was the magnum opus for Hutton in showing that his theory was true. But in reality, Walker says it's the exact opposite. It's some of the best evidence for a worldwide flood. Why? Well, down in the bottom of all of this, you have the same folded layers that you have in the bottom of the Grand Canyon. They had to be wet when that happened. They aren't cracked or broken in any way. So they're just curved. Then you have the fact that you have all different sizes buried together. Generally, if you have moving water, the larger, heavier objects will drop before the smaller, lighter material, but that isn't the case here. You also have rounded rocks, or you don't have rounded rocks, which you would have if this stuff had traveled a long distance. You don't have rounded sand grains, which you would also have if it had traveled a long distance. And the area that this covers is like 300 miles from one end to the other and 60 miles the other way. It wasn't a river that made this Sicker Point. It was a watery catastrophe, a large, huge water catastrophe. The other, I mentioned some of them, the other geologists up to that point, DeSauger, Werner, Dolomieu, DeLuc, none of them, they all included a flood of some kind, or floods, sometimes plural, in their cosmogonies. So Hutton was the first one that didn't include a flood. And the only reason he gave was this flimsy theological reason, and he knew nothing about theology. Finally, let us consider seriously what Stephen Baxter, who is one of the more perceptive biographers of James Hutton, has to say. He is generally favorable toward Hutton. He summarizes the message DeLuc was trying to convey regarding Hutton, and it is this: there was no evidence for a succession of worlds except in Hutton's imagination. Hutton's theory wasn't an argument about nature, but an invention specifically intended to attack Moses' account. And you know, when scientists criticize other scientists, there's several different levels it can go to. They generally only criticize the findings of that other scientist. They find holes in it and try to point those out. Sometimes they'll go beyond that and maybe discount their whole worldview, but seldom do they attack publicly the integrity of that other scientist. Well, that happened right here. In 1973, Dennis R. Dean published an article in the Annals of Science titled James Hutton and His Public, which helps us understand the difference in how people viewed science 250 years ago as opposed to today. Robert Boyle and Isaac Newton said things like they were thinking God's thoughts after him. So they did their science as a way to connect even closer to the God that they worshiped. Well, Hutton had a religious reason too. It was to eliminate God and to support deism. And the quote from Dean is this: ultimately, of course, religion is the central issue. Like other 18th century scientists, Hutton was a deist, which meant in this case that religion and geology were mutually supporting. He would not have agreed that the natural world is amoral or that scientific theories do not have religious consequences. Nowadays, most scientists, when they give you their secular cosmogony, they'll pretend to not have any relationship to a religious view. After Hutton died, his young friends, Playfair and Hall, organized the Friday Club, trying to keep Hutton's ideas alive and even see if they could get more interest in them. Because if they did not, being that they were on life support at that time, they would soon die out. They met every Friday in a tavern in Edinburgh, and some of the names involved, besides Playfair and Hall, were Sir Walter Scott, the poet, historian. Most of you probably read something he's written. Francis Horner, who was a politician in that area, and Sir Charles Lyell Sr., who was a botanist. He was likely acquainted with these men. His son, Sir Charles Lyell, was the geologist, and the younger Lyell married Mary Horner, the niece of Francis Horner. The senior Lyell read Playfair's illustrations of the Huttonian theory of the earth shortly after it was released in 1802. The younger Lyell read it not too many years later. It looked like the Friday Club was not very successful, and it broke up in 1819 when Playfair died. But in 1824, the younger Charles Lyell had Sir James Hall take him to see Sicker Point, and that seemed to make quite an impression upon Lyell. Since the Lyell family had inherited a fortune from Charles Lyell's grandfather, who was also, both his father and his grandfather were also named Charles Lyell. I don't know how far back that goes, but his grandfather made a fortune outfitting the British Navy that fought in the Revolutionary War. So you got to wonder about all the connections there, and I was just thinking about that. You might, if you can find the information, you could probably find some connections about some really unsavory connections between the grandfather and the British government, and how that all came to pass. Let's see, where was I at here? Since the Lyell family had inherited a fortune from the grandfather, Charles gave up practicing law at that point, and so he only practiced law for a year, I think. He started devoting all of his time to geology. He didn't need the money. This is the house, if you want to call it that, Lyell lived in as a child, the Canordy house. Lyell, Darwin, Hutton all lived lives apart from any financial concerns. Charles Lyell's law degree was not used to practice law, but he had learned how to parse words and manipulate people as well as any practicing lawyer. He used those talents for half a century to direct the fight to batter the church and establish unbelief in the Word of God. He controlled Darwin and Huxley as if they were puppets. So that's the house or castle, if you want to call it, there in northern Scotland. This is Charles Lyell's first geological wonder that he observed off the west coast of Scotland when he was 19. He should have observed that there was no evidence between any of these layers, no evidence of erosion between any of these layers, eliminating the idea of there being millions of years old. So you can see here, right here, here, and then down here, there's no evidence of any erosion of any kind. Those were laid down in sequence and probably very rapidly. Well, we know they were very rapidly, I just don't know how rapidly. Lyell's motives for his work are recorded in his letters to his friends. Writing to Paulette Scrope, who he asked to do the first review of his book, he says, and this is the quote up here, I am sure you may get into Quarterly Review, the well-read publication, the Quarterly Review, what will free the science from Moses. Free the science from Moses. Well, he assumed that Moses wrote the whole Genesis. My belief is that Genesis was written by a number of different people, and then it was handed down to Moses, who included that in the rest of the Pentateuch. Anyway, what he's getting at is he's wanting to free the science from the Bible. For if treated seriously, the party are quite prepared for it. So he was aware that the society was softening up. They weren't as conservative as they used to be. They were starting to get to the point where they would accept these really devious things that he was trying to do. In that quote and others like it, Lyell shows he is well aware of the changing social climate in Britain and knew if he and his social agitators were patient, they could draw the public away from Christianity. In a letter to his father-in-law, Leonard Horner, he wrote, at the last meeting of the Geological Society, Darwin read a paper of the connection of volcanic phenomena and elevation of mountain chains in support of my heretical doctrines. With a little tongue-in-cheek, Lyell seemed to always be gleeful at proposing heretical doctrines. Lyell and his friends had many laughs about his geology trashed Christianity. In a letter to George Tickner, an American in 1847, whom he had met on his trip to America in 1841, he writes, making the Bible a school book here, that is in Britain, and setting poor children to read Deuteronomy is a proof that our church teaching is not meant to open their minds. People will have education, so they manage thus by sham instruction to evade what they dread, i.e., the making them capable of thinking and reasoning. You can't be capable in a reasoning person if you value the Bible, I guess. In a letter to his friend, Principal Dawson, after Dawson asked him to review his new book, he responded that he read through the book with great interest, but replied to Dawson accordingly, I thought some parts very eloquent, but you well know I am one of those who despair of anyone being able to reconcile the modern facts of geology and of many other sciences with the old cosmogonies handed down to us by the unknown authors of the early chapters of Genesis. I could go on and on with these quotes showing his hostility to the Bible, and you will find many more in the book. But I will finish this topic today with one more. Writing to his friend, Paulette Scrope, telling him how to write the review of Lyell's first book. What? He's telling somebody how to write the review of his book? Aren't reviews supposed to be objective? Well, you're beginning to see what this man is made of right here. Has this guy no shame? He tips his hand on his methods and motives. And here's the quote: "If we don't irritate, which I fear we may, though mere history," he's saying the Bible is mere history, "we shall carry all with us. If you don't triumph over them, but compliment the liberality and candor of the present age, the bishops and the saints will join us in despising both the ancient and modern physical theologians." He admits that he despises the theologians, the ancient ones being the writers of the Bible. The modern ones, the physical theologians, are those theologians who are willing to tie the geology of the earth, basically the flood, to the Bible. He doesn't like that. He says that basically he thinks if you're a theologian, you should not make comments about that. Here's the formula that worked so well that allowed Lyle to decimate the church. Number one, make a statement of fact that contradicts the Bible, but do not mention the Bible. Let your listener figure that out. That way it looks like you're not really attacking the Bible, you're just making a statement of fact. And number two, attribute the statement of fact to someone else, hopefully a person with authority. And then number three, base your own conclusions upon the fact in order to reinforce the validity of the original fact. That way, people will not hate you. You're just the messenger. And it isn't even your message. You're attributing it to someone else. Nevertheless, you have created doubt in their minds regarding the reliability of the Word of God. Here is a polystrate tree at the Bay of Fundy in Nova Scotia. Lyle saw this, and many more just like it, and wrote a letter to his sister, Mary Ann. He always confided in Mary Ann things that he wouldn't tell other people. Mary Ann would go along with anything. She never criticized him. Telling her how wonderful it was, but he did not mention it to anyone else because by itself it totally destroyed his life's work. How could a tree grow through millions of layers in the ground? Obviously it can't, and there were many examples like this there at the Bay of Fundy. You can still see them today. Although Lyle was Hutton's chief apologist, he did not talk about Hutton's omission of a flood. What an important issue to leave out. But that's what Lyle did. He didn't generally contradict things that were opposed to his theory. He hid them. He didn't talk about them. And if he admitted that Hutton left the flood out, it was not allowed because of a religious argument, which is the case. It would have been extremely embarrassing to Lyle, because Lyle knew that Hutton had no religious training. Lyle never discussed all the numerous contradictions to his hypothesis that he found. You'll read about these in the book. Many of you are familiar with this. This anomaly is in the Columbia River Gorge. Is there any way Lyle could make this look millions of years old? Wedged into the dark basalt is a limestone chunk. In the middle of that is a log, partly permineralized and partly still organic. Lyle would probably be in favor of widening the highway right here. So here's the basalt, and it's down here. And then you can see here where the limestone is dozing in there. And then right in here, there's a log. This end of it is like rock. And then this end, you can pull out little soft chunks and start them on fire. I don't know if he ever saw anything like that, but would certainly make him scratch his head, and he'd write a letter to Mary Ann. This, of course, is the Little Grand Canyon up in Mount St. Helens, which was made in probably a few hours. On one occasion in France, Lyle was to meet with an aspiring young French geologist. He wanted to obtain specific information from the young man regarding the locale at which he was then working, but was afraid the young man would be very prying, since by that time Lyle was pretty highly regarded in France. He did not care to share all his secrets with the young man, so he told his father that he would, that if he sensed he was going to be prying, or too prying, he would pretend to not be able to speak French well enough to continue the conversation with him. Is that honest? This is the man that we rely on to have the integrity to give us the truth about matters related to our origins. Is that smart? We need to vet people better than that. Here, Lyle runs into more evidence that destroys his life's goal, that of destroying the church, but he would rather accept a falsehood and admits as much to Darwin. He says in his letter to Darwin, "This gneiss, so ancient that if had been crystallized and then thrown into vertical and curved stratification, even before the trilobites flourished. This most ancient rock is so beautifully soldered onto the granite, so nicely threaded by veins large and small, that had you not known the immense difference of age, you would be half staggered with the suspicion that all was made at one batch." Duh. The evolutionist Steve Gould, unlike many evolutionists, could at times be forthrightly honest about things. He probably at times suffered the wrath of his peers for some of the things he said. The following quote is one of those times. We have it on the screen here. Charles Lyell was trained as a lawyer, and his book is more a brief for gradualism than an impartial account of evidence. Lyell denigrated catastrophism as an antiquated, last-ditch effort by miracle mongers trying to preserve the Mosaic chronology of an earth only a few thousand years old. I doubt that a more unfair characterization has ever been offered for a reputable scientific worldview. That's an evolutionist making that comment. Obviously not a Lyell admirer. In 1841, on his first trip to America, Lyell visited Niagara Falls, and I think probably when they sent him over, they asked him to go and make a report on Niagara Falls. He was told that the falls were receding about 3 feet per year, and since the gorge that had been cut was 35,000 feet long, at that rate, it would have taken about 12,000 years to cut the gorge. But downstream, the gorge is narrower, and the hard limestone was thinner there as well, indicating the rate of erosion was much faster in the past. It is not hard to see that the gorge could have been carved in as little as 4,000 years. But Lyell changed the rate to 1 foot per year in his report to the Geological Society. He probably chafed at 35,000 years for the gorge, let alone 4,000. Again, is this honest? He knew that it was no less than 3 feet per year, and if he had any sense at all, he'd realize that it was faster in the past. So changing it to 1 foot per year helps him a little bit, but it certainly doesn't give him the millions of years that he wished he had there. When Charles Darwin left on his voyage on the Beagle, he was apparently not acquainted with Charles Lyell, but because of a gift to him, he had Lyell's newly published book with him. He studied it intensely and made numerous, mostly geological observations on the voyage, which he sent home. They became a hot topic at Cambridge University, and without knowing it, he had become somewhat of a celebrity. I'm sure being on that voyage, there wasn't a whole lot to do. Probably the worst situation in the world for somebody to be reading a book to warp their mind. Lyell caught wind of that, and upon Darwin's return, he was there to introduce himself, and he never lost sight of Darwin again. Darwin spent the first 4 years back pondering religion, but Lyell was prodding him to think about biology as it applied to the long ages. Darwin had truly become a puppet for Lyell. Consider this quote from Darwin, and we have it on the screen. "I always feel as if my books came half out of Lyell's brain, and that I never acknowledged this sufficiently, for I have always thought the great merit of the Principles was that it altered the whole tone of one's mind." Charles Lyell knew the shy Darwin would never do the job of publicizing his book, and that is where Tom Huxley comes in. Lyell also met him as he came off the rattlesnake after 5 years in the South Seas. Lyell knew that Huxley's aggression was perfect for getting Lyell's book out to the world, so he put the two so dissimilar men together, and as they say, the rest is history. Darwin had a relationship of several decades with Harvard botany professor Asa Gray. The two seemed to share deep personal feelings about things through their letters. Gray knew Darwin was a regular reader of the North British Review, and in 1867 sent a letter to that publication to be published anonymously that was highly critical of natural selection. That article was referred to in 1869 when Darwin was explaining his previous reasoning processes in a letter to that publication. And here's the letter. "I saw also that the preservation in a state of nature of any occasional deviation of structure, such as a monstrosity, would be a rare event, and that if at first preserved, it would generally be lost by subsequent intercrossing with ordinary individuals. Nevertheless, until reading an able and valuable article in the North British Review in 1867, I did not appreciate how rarely single variations, whether slight or strongly marked, would be perpetuated." Now, for some reason, didn't know that Gray had sent that letter. He thought the writer was a guy by the name of Fleming Jenkin. I'm sure that Gray knew exactly how to write that letter and have the maximum effect on Darwin. It looked to Darwin like it was another person besides Gray that disagreed with natural selection. Darwin promised the world that after Origin, he would be coming out with another book that would have actual examples of natural selection at work in real life, since Origin was only speculation with humans doing the selecting with domestic animals. Lyell was referring to that in the following quote, and this is the quote on the screen. My dear Darwin, I have just finished reading your volume. This is about 3 months after he had come out with the book. And right glad I am that I did my best with Hooker to persuade you to publish it without waiting for a time which probably could never have arrived, though you lived to the age of 100, when you had prepared all your facts on which you ground so many grand speculations. It is a splendid case of close reasoning and long sustained argument, even before your detailed proofs appear, such as your pigeons and cirripedes, of which you make excellent use. Bold print mine. Many grand speculations. I mean that, as I fully expect, a new edition is soon called for. You may here and there insert an actual case to relieve the vast number of abstract propositions. Bold print mine. After Gray's letter to the North British Review and Darwin's acknowledgement in 1869, Darwin said no more in public about natural selection, and he never came out with that big book that was supposed to make everything clear. With Lyell, Hooker, Huxley, all rejecting natural selection, and now Gray, he was running out of encouragers for his big idea. Darwin's old college professor at Cambridge, Adam Sedgwick, had an affection for Darwin and would not have wanted to publicly embarrass him, but he was brutally honest with him in a personal letter. He was a priest and saw the spiritual damage the book was going to do. Bishop Wilkin wrote a book in the 1600s that had a lot of futuristic science in it. That pertains to this letter, and I'll read the letter. I have read your book with more pain than pleasure. Parts of it I admire greatly. Parts I laughed at till my sides were almost sore. I can imagine his mind going in so many directions, thinking these monstrosities that Darwin was putting out there. Other parts I read with absolute sorrow, because I think them utterly false and grievously mischievous. You have deserted the true method of induction and started off in machinery and as wild as Bishop Wilkins' locomotive that was to sail with us to the moon. That was Sedgwick. There's time to take a break. I will finish my presentation after the break.
Yes.
So I really appreciate it. Okay, so Darwin's pet theory, natural selection, was not accepted by Lyell or Hooker. Surely the man who was most responsible for the acceptance of evolution in millions of years would believe in it, wouldn't he? No. Thomas Huxley was the most opposed to it of all. This quote of his was revealed after his passing, and that is this: the Darwinian hypothesis, note he does not call it a theory. The Darwinian hypothesis may be stated in a very few words, and that is, all species have been produced by the development of variety from common stock by the process of natural selection, which process is essentially identical with that artificial selection by which man has originated the races of domestic animals. But without the breeder, there would be no selection, and without the selection, no race. It must be proved that there is in nature some power which takes the place of man and performs a selection sua sponte. And sua sponte means action not controlled by man. Brackets, part of the original text. Darwin's frustration with Huxley over natural selection was evident after one of Huxley's lectures, which Darwin had the rare opportunity to attend. Darwin states, I succeeded in persuading myself for 24 hours that Huxley's lecture was a success. Parts were eloquent and good and all very bold, and I heard strangers say, what a good lecture. I told Huxley so, but after conversation with others and more reflection, I must confess that as an exposition of the doctrine, the lecture seems to me an entire failure. He gave no just idea of natural selection. Brackets, part of the original text. Here's a photo of Thomas Huxley at the chalkboard. This was his main method of persuasion, what they call morphology, showing the similarity of body parts in various creatures. He was an excellent artist and spoke with great authority. Why was Huxley such an ardent supporter of evolution if he was so opposed to its main argument, natural selection? The answer lies in his extreme hatred of Christianity. And here's a quote. My screed was meant as a protest against theology and parsondom, both of which are in my mind the natural and irreconcilable enemies of science. Few see it, but I believe we are on the eve of a new reformation, and if I have a wish to live 30 years, it is that I may see the foot of science on the necks of her enemies. Huxley here correctly calls out the compromising theologians. Too bad not more theologians could see as clearly on this issue as he does. He says, I do not believe that any meaning which would be put by a disinterested Hebrew scholar upon the words of Genesis is in any way reconcilable with the most elementary and best established facts of geology. If it be permissible to turn and twist the scripture phraseology as the rationalistic orthodox do on Genesis with gap theory, day age, and so on, I, for my part, will undertake to prove that rape, murder, and arson are positively enjoined in Exodus. He says the Christian faith is regarded by 9/10 of the population as the authoritative standard of fact. That doesn't sit well with him. And he says, the myths of paganism are as dead as Osiris or Zeus, and the man who should revive them would be justly laughed to scorn. But the coeval imaginations current among the rude inhabitants of Palestine have unfortunately not shared their fate, but even at this day are regarded by 9/10 of the civilized world as the authoritative standard of fact. The ex-clubbers were Huxley's 9-member club, all of whom were aligned with him in ideology and methods. Here, Huxley exposes the ex-clubbers' true intentions. Science exhibits no immediate intention of signing a treaty of peace with her old opponent, religion, nor of being content with anything short of absolute victory and uncontrolled domination over the whole realm of the intellect. Does this sound like an objective scientist to you? This relates to a scathing article in the Reader, the ex-clubber's publication, that Huxley had written with his reply to his old protege, George Rolleston, who had been critical of the article. There is no equivocation here. It's Huxley's way or the highway. So here's his response to Rolleston's criticism. The fact is that you have read into the article what you know or think you know of my opinions. There is not a word in that article opposed to any forms of belief in a revelation of the unknowable. All that I affirm is that all these beliefs and traditions will have to find a scientific basis, and those which cannot will have to go. Huxley's ex-clubber friend, John Tyndall, states their objections pretty simply right here. We claim, and we shall wrest from theology, the entire domain of cosmological theory. Now, this quote accurately describes the crux of the issues revolving around the creation-evolution debate. In an article in 1890, he wrote in the periodical The 19th Century. The name of the article is called The Lights of the Church and the Light of Science. My utmost ingenuity does not enable me to discover a flaw in the argument thus briefly summarized. I am fairly at a loss to comprehend how anyone, for a moment, can doubt that Christian theology must stand or fall with the historical trustworthiness of the Jewish scriptures. The very conception of the Messiah, or Christ, is inextricably interwoven with Jewish history. The identification of Jesus of Nazareth with that Messiah rests upon the interpretation of passages of the Hebrew Scriptures, which have no evidential value unless they possess the historical character assigned to them. If the covenant with Abraham was not made, if the 10 words were not written by God's hand on the stone tables, if Abraham is more or less a mythical hero, such as Theseus, the story of the deluge a fiction, that of the fall a legend, and that of the creation the dream of a seer, if all these definite and detailed narratives of apparently real events have no more value as history than have the stories of the regal period of Rome, what is to be said about the messianic doctrine, which is so much less clearly enunciated? And what about the authority of the writers of the books of the New Testament, who on this theory have not merely accepted flimsy fictions for solid truths, but have built the very foundations of Christian dogma upon legendary quicksands? He was right to think that the events of the Bible should be real events in history, but he was 180 degrees wrong to think there was no evidence to support them. The Huxleys visited Down House, which was Darwin's home, years after Darwin was gone. Much to everyone's surprise, the cook, a Christian lady, walked out, refusing to serve the godless Tom Huxley. When he died, he requested no mention of God be made at his funeral. Despite no announcement of the funeral, 200 people showed up. Huxley was invited to speak at an event, and a prayer was made before the accompanying meal was served. A reporter at the event remarked about how odd it was to invite both God and Huxley to the same event. Huxley got his start as a scientist, but late in life, almost all of his writing was against Christianity. Like Charles Lyell, he read Hutton as a child, several times, in fact. In America, a man by the name of Horace Mann rose to the top of influence in American education. Until that time, the Bible and books based upon the Bible were used in the classroom, and the schools were in the churches. Mann wanted to put an end to that, and he largely succeeded. The following two quotes will give you a tip-off as to what Horace Mann's worldview was. He is often called the father of American education. I call him the bastard father of American education, and struggle to see how we let this man or his successor, John Dewey, have that much control over the education of our children. Here's one of his quotes. What the church has been for medieval man, the public school must become for democratic and rational man. God will be replaced by the concept of the public good. The common schools shall create a more far-seeing intelligence and a purer morality than has ever existed among communities of men. He expanded on this goal, adding that he wanted a new religion with the state as its true church and education as its Messiah. 1859 was an eventful year. Mann died that year. Darwin released his book in November, and the man who would carry on Mann's onslaught on American education and America itself, John Dewey, was born. Dewey, like many at that time, was not well versed on the science behind evolution, but he was a big fan of its influence on society. John Dewey was known as a philosopher early in his career, and his philosophy was based largely upon his study of Thomas Huxley and John Tyndall's writings, with a heavy dose of social evolutionism being an essential part of that. He later adapted those ideas to form what American education should look like. In 1940, there was an uproar in New York City about the city schools. See if I can read that better with my glasses on. Having given British sexual deviant Bertrand Russell a visiting professorship of philosophy, which they withdrew upon seeing the amount of opposition it was creating. The announcement of it was published way back in the newspaper. They didn't expect to get the kind of overflowing letters protesting this that they got. Harvard, however, still had an offer to Russell for the same thing, and Dewey wrote to the Harvard's professor, W.E. Hawking, encouraging them to keep the offer open. And here's a little bit out of his letter to Hawking. If men are going to be kept out of American colleges because they express unconventional, unorthodox, or even unwise views on political, economic, social, or moral matters is included, I am heartily glad my own teaching days have come to an end. There will always be some prostitutes in any institution. It appears Dewey was indignant that restrictions exist on what a professor could say or do in the classroom. Dewey was often at odds with President Hutchins at the University of Chicago, which was a Baptist institution. In an article titled Rationality in Education, he writes, Hutchins undervalues scientific, naturalistic philosophy. He has a static conception of man and human needs, and finally, he holds to an absolutist view of truth, which is the same everywhere and at all times. Imagine that. The president of a Baptist college holds to absolute truth. Dewey was working on another book when he died called Naturalism, a criticism of Western religion, and comparing it to the superior models of the Greeks. The following quote shows his disregard for the parents' role in the education of their children. The public schools can keep the children occupied throughout the day with sports and after-school homework in the evening. The parents will have less than an hour a day with their children, and families and Christian churches' influence over them can be broken in about a generation. This guy is in charge of our education. We want to break the parents and the Christian church's influence over them. And I'm old enough to remember back in the 1950s. I was born in 46, so I started school in 52. And the first 4 years I was in school, I had teachers that were closely aligned with Dewey. I don't know what their connection was, but they were, all of his ideas were part of their worldview, and I remember that, and I remember parents discussing John Dewey and how much evil was caused by him, and I never really understood it all until I got into studying his life. One of the life goals that Dewey would be most proud of would be the establishment of the American Humanist Manifesto in 1933, in which he was a prominent signer. Here are the two main parts, which are further broken down in the complete document. First, you got religious humanists regard the universe as self-existing and not created. That's cosmological evolution. Second, humanism believes that man is a part of nature and that he has emerged as a result of a continuous process. That's biological evolution. In 1973, the American Humanist Association wrote a new manifesto. Every part of this could have come directly out of James Hutton's Principles of Knowledge. That's that book that I worked so hard to get. An 18th century geologist and a 20th century document bearing the stamp of John Dewey have exactly the same worldview. In the American Humanist Association 73, we read, "We affirm that moral values derive their source from human experience. Ethics is autonomous and situational, needing no theological or ideological sanction. Ethics stems from human need and interest. Happiness and the creative realization of human needs and desires, individually and in shared enjoyment, are continuous themes of humanism. We strive for the good life here and now." James Hutton said the same thing almost 200 years earlier. Here's Hutton's quote. "The myths, the dogmas, the rituals of traditional religion, with their authoritarian tone, are irrelevant to the resolution of our problems. Humans must be the sole judge of right and wrong, because ethics and morality do not need theological sanctification. Morality is a product of human experience. Higher authorities must not be allowed to dictate morality." The AMA on Religion versus Science. I'll read the quote. "We believe, however, that traditional dogmatic or authoritarian religions that place revelation, God, ritual, or creed above human needs and experience do a disservice to the human species. Any account of nature should pass the scientific evidence, in our judgment. The dogmas and myths of traditional religions do not do so." Didn't Tom Huxley say that religion should be required to be scientifically verified? Nothing new here. The modern humanists are only repeating what the founders of evolution previously expressed in their philosophical digressions. Let's see what these 5 emperors have given us to defend their godless worldviews. We will start with the oldest first. James Hutton received very little support for his ideas during his lifetime. He eliminated the flood from his cosmogony with the flimsiest excuse, consisting of a theological argument from someone who knew no theology. Charles Lyell used Hutton's rejected hypothesis and did not even mention Hutton's elimination of the flood. Lyell gave no convincing reason for the long ages, but despised the theologians by his own admission. Charles Darwin based his whole argument on natural selection, but gave up defending it after about 10 years when he received very little support for it. The big book he promised that would explain everything was never published. And Thomas Huxley never was very enthusiastic about supporting evolution scientifically. He was an angry agnostic who spent most of his time attacking Christianity and Christians. John Dewey loved evolution because it gave him a forum for tearing down the structures of the moral society that he was a part of. He took it to the next level and started formal humanism, which is now destroying our world. That's all, folks. Now here, you'll see this tree in the front of the book. Down at the bottom, let's see if I can point that out here. Down here, this is deism that got everything going. I got to put my glasses back on. You're fortunate you don't have to wear these things. As you go up the tree, you have, this is arranged somewhat chronologically. So here's the Horners, Francis and Leonard, and of course Leonard's daughter married Charles Lyell. Here's Asa Gray, Erasmus Darwin, James Hutton, Playfair and Hall, who were his big admirers. And after Hutton, we had the millions of years come in. And here's some of the people that were involved in that. Robert Chambers and Thomas Malthus were somewhat inspiring to Darwin when he wrote his book. His book, by the way, was just a compilation of all of the notes that he had made over the years. Then we have Huxley, Hooker, who was Darwin's best friend. And then the ex-clubbers that Huxley put together. And then they brought in evolution along about that time, and then a few years later, humanism. And then in the 1900s, humanism became formalized. And these are just some of the results of all of that. Sexual licentiousness, no prayer in schools, pornography, situational ethics, evolution in the classroom, but no creation allowed, homosexual rights, abortion, divorce, alcoholism, drug addiction, big business corruption, gambling addictions, government corruption, and it goes on and on. That's all a result of our giving up the Bible, which was the whole intention of these emperors. And I don't think they had any idea of what the result was going to be. They wanted the freedom, but they didn't realize all that difficulty that was going to be caused by that. This is Hall's drawing of what they saw out at Sicker Point, and that's the end. Guess we can take some questions now.
Yes, thank you very much. Milt?